Can I request my colleague Shubhangi to just do some house announcements and then we can just begin?
Yes, thank you, Amol. So welcome all for joining for this session. Before we start, I would just want to do some housekeeping announcements. So I request all the participants to keep their mics on mute and videos on off. And if they have any comments for the panelists, they can post in the chat box and direct it to the host of the session, and we will take them up during the panel discussion. I also want to indicate that this session is being recorded and is being streamed on YouTube. I hope you all have a productive session. And now over to Mr. Bipul Chatterjee for opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Amal. Thank you, Shubhangi. On behalf of CUTS International, let me welcome all of you to this session on data governance. This is one area where we have been working for the last 2 years, more than 2 years. And that's because of several reasons. I would like to highlight a couple of them. First is our life is becoming more and more data driven or data oriented, whether we like it or not. Of course, there are a number of challenges, there are a number of advantages as well, but that is becoming, and COVID-19, I think that has accelerated it. So that's one important thing which you need to note. Secondly, our economic activities in all spheres, they are also becoming more and more data driven or data based. Again, there are advantages as well as challenges. So keeping these basic premises or basic developments in mind, we are primarily looking at consumer welfare dimensions of data-based economy or digital economy. Of course, digital economy is much larger in sense as compared to data-based economy, or maybe vice versa. I'm not going into that debate at this moment. Therefore, it's very important we look at the governance aspects of data. And we have several developments which are taking place all over the world on how to govern data. First of all, whether we take data as a commodity or not. Data is being used both for manufacturing products as well as for services. Secondly, there are different ways of interpreting a particular data. It could be, for example, there's a data which could be, I may want to hide because of my individual privacy, but that may be important for our societal security. So then there is personal data, there is non-personal data, there is also interface between the two. So in India, what we are seeing that there are a number of initiatives which are being taken by the government as well as non-governmental agencies to first to understand what do you mean by data governance, and secondly, how do we govern data, both personal as well as non-personal data. So keeping that in mind, and as I said that we have been working on this subject for various aspects of this subject for more than 2 years now, and what we have decided that this year in 2021, or rather from 2021 onwards, we are going to have a webinar or a discussion forum like this in every quarter. And we have changed it as Manthan, CUTS Manthan on digital economy or data-based economy. So this is the first of the series that we are starting today. And I'm very grateful to the speakers, eminent panelists. Some of you know very well. I personally know very well for their time, for their consent to speak on a subject which is, I think, is already very important and is going to become more and more important. I would stop here, but before that, I'd just like to highlight one thing. While we are working in India on this matter, it's also becoming important internationally, and there are various forums where data governance is being discussed. For example, at the WTO, in the context of the plurilateral negotiation, though India is not part of that, on e-commerce, electronic commerce, data governance is being discussed in a big way. So no, I mean, maybe going forward, I think, given the importance of this subject And given the fact that is already affecting or impacting our everyday life and is going to impact further, consumer welfare dimensions become very, very important. So going in future, we may see that there could be a multilateral agreement on data governance, and already it is being discussed in the larger rubric of internet governance. So this is where I think we as a consumer advocacy group, we have to play a significant role, which is legitimate, not just to represent Indian consumers, but also the consumers at large, because this is again one area which is very much linked to various consumer rights, right to choice, for example, yeah, right to redressal. That's another area where uh, uh, you can see there are clear linkages. So on that note, let me now stop here and request my colleague Shubhangi Heda. She has been working on this subject from the very beginning, and she is going to make a brief presentation about on issues which you are going to cover in today's webinar. Thank you, and over to you, Shubhangi.
Thank you, Vipul sir. Can I please request Akshay to just share the slides? Yes. Thank you so much. This presentation is going to give a brief overview of the policy brief, which is being prepared by CUTS International on future of data governance in India, and to highlight some of the key issues from a consumer perspective, and also to highlight some of the way forward, taking into account some of the assessments which we have made through our comparative jurisdictional analysis. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is just to give a broad overview of the kind of policies which are in the pipeline and existing within the data governance landscape within India. So within all these policies, I just want to highlight that there are two kinds of narratives that have been building. One, on one side of the narrative is digital advancement, innovation, and unlocking the potential of data. And on the other hand, all the policies have been striving to preserve consumers' welfare and data protection. But I think in the recent times, we are seeing an increasing focus on the narratives around fostering digital economy and capitalizing on the value of data. However, there has been a marginalization of concerns regarding solidifying transparency and accountability mechanisms. As I understand, both these narratives must go hand in hand, and we must recenter our focus back to the consumers as an important unit of facilitating economic benefit. Next slide, please. Thank you. So while we look at consumer perspectives, we must look at what is the consumer perspective in all of the data chain. Starting from the data collection point, it becomes important that how we utilize our consent architectures, what is the capacity of the consumers to actually interact with this architecture, and whether in fact the consumers even trust this architecture. On the point of data generation, I think there has been an increasing emphasis on creating binaries between personal and non-personal data with a heavy reliance on anonymization techniques. But the anonymization techniques itself, maybe in the practicality of actually applying these techniques may in fact be debatable. Within the CUTS Privacy Perception Survey, it was highlighted that the identification of data actually relates back to consumers' perception and the context. And it's a similar observation which have been made in the European context as well. Thus, we need to question that where does the consumer benefits lie if these lines between personal and non-personal data gets blurred. On the stage of data processing and analysis, as we understand that there might be sharing of data from data custodians to other parties. And here there are two different narratives that seems to emerge as data minimization, which seems to be an essential core concept of data protection, and data sharing models, which seems to be an essential point where digital economy or data economy needs to be enhanced. We need to question that whether how can we balance both these models to enhance the benefit of the consumers? Last but not the least, it is important that consumers must understand what are the new kind of harms and risks which are emerging from these big data set, and there might be profiling issues, and there may be exclusion errors which may be emerging from the basic interpretation of data as a public good. Thus, it becomes important to actually provide a grievance redress system for the consumers. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the cross-jurisdictional analysis actually indicate a few jurisdictions which are really important and give us some learning lessons. European data strategy actually focuses on a rights-based approach to data sharing. Singaporean data sharing frameworks actually focuses on advancing the business practices such that the consumers can facilitate data sharing with businesses. Australian data release and sharing reform actually stipulates for purpose limitations within sharing of data even with the government, and UK data strategy specifically focuses on responsible use of data. Next slide, please. On the way forward, I just want to highlight that we need to recenter our focus to a rights-based approach and see consumers as a starting point of digital policy. We need to build trust-based framework for our intermediaries which are emerging in the digital economy, and have a transparent regulatory process in which consumers can have a clear pathway of which regulators to go to for the redress. Thank you. And now I want to hand it over to Mr. Bipul Chatterjee to take the proceedings forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shubhangi, for setting this context. I think you have done it quite beautifully. The Amol Kulkarni, my colleague, who is Director Research at CUTS, he is the lead. He's our lead on this vertical. So we are going to have a panel discussion now. We have an excellent set of speakers, and I'm sure that we are going to learn new things, new knowledge from them. So let me now request Amol to take over and moderate the panel discussion. Over to you, Amol.
Thank you very much, Bipul, and thank you, Shubhangi, for your presentation. So just before I deep dive into the questions to our panelists, I'll just make some brief, quick remarks. First is that we are having this discussion at a very crucial time when data governance frameworks and legislations in India are being deliberated at different levels. What we're seeing, and what was visible in our study as well, is there is an exciting tension between individual rights, community benefits, and the role of state to uphold national security and ensure that community can benefit or public can benefit from innovation and competition. We are also seeing that state and private sector are increasingly collaborating to leverage the potential of data economy in India. And the data economy is pegged to be around $1 trillion within next 2 years. So within this sort of evolving framework, the question that we want to discuss and deliberate is, where does consumer fit within all this? This is very important to, it is very important to discuss this, because this will be the key question to determine the path which digital economy takes going forward. And would consumers have the right to decide by themselves for the data that they are generating and how it can be used for their benefit? With this opening remarks, I will deep dive into the panel discussion. I would like to thank our panelists again for sparing their valuable time for this discussion. And also I would like to thank our participants who are here to listen to the discussion. I would encourage the participants to enter their questions on the chat box so that we can ask the panelists as and when time permits. So I would like to start with Dr. Amar Patnaik, who needs no introduction. He is a member of parliament and member of Joint Parliamentary Committee on Personal Data Protection Bill. Dr. Patnaik, as you have noticed from our study and also the initial discussion, is that across the world we are witnessing different data governance structures. You have also analyzed these structures, including privacy-based model of governance as well as ownership-based model of governance, and you have called for accountability-based model of data governance in India. Would you like to deliberate more on that, sir? And also, if you could throw some light on the transparency and status of personal data protection bill as is being currently discussed at the JPC level, because that is a frequent question which our audience community is asking. Thank you very much, and over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Amol, and thank you, my friend Vipul, the rest of the crowd at CUTS, and all the panelists here. Let me answer the second question first by saying that the Personal Data Protection Bill, which was introduced in 2019 in the Parliament, has gone through an extensive process of consultation by the Joint Parliamentary Committee set up for that purpose. And I think during the COVID, when most of us were under lockdown, it is actually this committee which was working literally every week. And we were there for almost, I think, a couple of days, if not more, in a week at Delhi discussing the various clauses of the bill. So it is well on track. And I think we can safely, in our country, all of us can safely conclude that we would be probably having a very robust data protection law, which would take into account all the aspects that you discussed here about balancing between individual privacy, state interest, and digital economy. So that's the status. And where exactly the status is, I think the consultation within the Parliamentary Committee, one round is over, and we may likely see something happening very early on. But having said so, I must also say that the data protection or the privacy principle, if you look at the judgments of the Supreme Court of India, they and 30 years back and 40 years back, so the way the perception and the judicial interpretation of privacy and the role of government in privacy, the role of citizen in privacy, the right-based model, how the perception has changed over a period of 40 years. You can see from the judgments from one end of the country, from the one extreme of privacy not being fundamental to an individual's rights. So the judgment in 2017 and 18, two judgments of Kuddaswamy, which made privacy a fundamental right. And when it's a part of right to life and liberty, which is probably not expressed with legal backing anywhere in the world. The fundamental right status ensures that a citizen's right to privacy is guaranteed now by the Constitution itself. It is not by the state. It is not by the data fiduciary. The state itself is a data fiduciary. So it is guaranteed by the Constitution, and it will be enforced in courts of this country. So that's a very different kind of regime that we are going to usher in because of this particular ground principle which has been set by the Honorable Supreme Court. Now, when I talked about in my article about the various models of data protection, personal data protection that we can follow, I talked about essentially three basic models. I said there is this privacy model, which the privacy model for data protection, which is what we have adopted. The B.N. Sri Krishna Committee also adopted, and I believe the EU GDPR. So I think next after going through the EU GDPR is also based on the fact that citizens, or rather data principals, or the person who is generating the data principles, the citizens' privacy is the most important thing, and therefore, while doing anything with the data, the privacy has to be guarded. It would require that you first take the consent of the individual for doing anything with this data, for whether you are trying to collect it, for what purpose, and why, how long it will be stored, how long it will be used, what are the inferred data that will come out of it, what is the algorithm that is going to use. Everything actually is supposed to be there in the privacy model. And that therefore requires, as I have mentioned, a high level of compliance cost for the data fiduciaries, and might create a problem. The negative point is it might create a problem for the newbies in the market, or those who are coming into business, like the startups and all, because they're small or medium and small scale sector companies, because they would have to cost to ensure that they get all these consents, and also build an infrastructure that will protect this data. So there are, of course, carve-outs which have been made to sandboxes. So this one model. The second model is the one which you talked about, is the data ownership model, in which it is the citizen owns the data principal owns the data. Now, if someone, and that's the raw data. Now, if it has been generated and someone adds value to it and generates a separate set of data, that is the data source becomes different, then he owns the data. The asset becomes, the data is an asset here. So a person who has sold the data is no more the owner of the data. And in which case, it is the non-personal data protection framework which our committee has suggested is something like this, in which case the advantage is it is a frictionless, free-flowing data everywhere. The data marketization takes place very fast. A vibrant data market comes very fast. Innovation might take place very fast. Everything is good, but then privacy takes a backseat. The third model, which I was suggesting, is the accountability, the harm-based model. Why I suggest this is, or which is there in many places, is the fact that in the privacy model, particularly in the Indian context, the consent is not really informed. Then number two, the consent, which has been there for everything, if you ask for consent, then there is some kind of a consent fatigue. And the third one I talked about is the high compliance cost. But if you take the accountability of the harm model, the advantage is that even if you have given a consent for the use of your data, but while processing the data or doing whatever with the data, there is a harm which is caused to the data principal. In such a case, the responsibility or the accountability shall remain on the data fiduciary. Now, what happens is that in this case is that the data principal is fully protected, whereas the accountability is very high. But the advantage is that the data fiduciary would not probably initially have to take series of consents. There may not be any high compliance cost, maybe may not be there, but there will be definitely not consent fatigue or whatever, or in any other form as it may entail. But the advantage is that the accountability would ensure that the data fiduciary puts in controls and structures that would ensure the data is protected of the principle that has been collected. It might again, it might actually end up in having a little bit of a compliance cost, but because upfront you don't have to do many things. You build it slowly. In the continuum, it is at the other end. There, of course, are other models which you talked about, the Australian model, the ethics-based model. That is, you have a code of ethics, and the persons who are collecting data, they are following that ethics. It's a data ethics culture that you have to develop. But that, I believe, is something which must permeate the entire system completely, irrespective of which model you follow, because these ethics are eventually, ultimately, they are voluntary, they are self-regulating, and we must try to bring in that kind of a system for the consumer to have confidence that his data is not going to cause him harm. The moment this trust is broken, data flow itself will decrease, and the use of data for growth of economy, or even for the growth of the individual himself by various, let's say if his health data he doesn't give it, then eventually he would be probably a loser if there is some kind of a pandemic situation or anything that happens. So it's a very complex world, and the balanced approach to this would be not a watertight point. I think as we grow And as the economy grows, as the number of transactions grows, as data awareness increases, which is lacking currently, and things get much more digitized, because you must remember that this data protection law that we are bringing in is not only for electronic data, it is for the huge volume of data that is there with the government at the panchayat level, at the gram panchayat level, at the district collector's offices, which may be getting, which are currently, a major portion of it is currently being captured and processed in a manual way, in a manual manner. But these data would actually be covered under the data protection law that is going to come up. So I would end by saying that the data governance model has to be very dynamic. It has to respond to the way the data awareness increases and the way data market develops. The development of data market, I'm very careful about making this statement. The development of the data market is very important, and therefore what is important at this juncture is that we should allow the market to develop and not impose a huge number of regulations that the market just doesn't get developed. And why it is therefore required to be dynamic is, once the market develops, there may be questions of regulations, and just as in any other sector, the regulations will also be dynamic. It will change depending on responding to the way the data market would require you to respond, and also depending on the awareness that is there, that develops within the data principles, and the ethics that the data processors and the data fiduciaries choose to follow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Patnaik, for your excellent opening remarks. I would like to now move to Mr. B.N. Satpathy, who is a senior advisor with the Government of India and has also previously advised the Niti Aayog. Sir, you have heard what Dr. Patnaik has said about the dynamic nature of governance models and need to let the data market evolve. How do you see the data markets evolving and the country leveraging citizen-generated data? What do you think are the risks which we need to be wary, and how can those risks be addressed as we try and experiment with different data governance models with the objective of achieving $1 trillion digital economy? Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Quest International, for inviting me to this webinar. I'm coming back to Quest after a long time. I have a completely different take on this subject. The central objective of the data governance architecture is how to make ease of living. That's the central objective of the consumer or the citizen. How do I get the data that I require so that I make my living very easy? The logic for this comes back to the Information Technology Act 2000. If you look at the 2000 Act, it was basically to give a legal recognition to electronic communication, electronic content, and e-commerce, and also delivery of services on electronic. That was the major architecture of IT Act 2000. And in the process, in the last 20 years, technology has overtaken, and social media has emerged. And so many things have happened so that today we are having a Information Technology Rules 2021, which is a subject of discussion. I'll not go into those rules and all that. We should, so that we don't miss the central objective. How do I make my data governance architecture such that it serves the need of the common man, or the man who has a mobile but doesn't have an internet, who has both a mobile internet and doesn't want to be flooded with all unnecessary information? This problem became very serious in COVID-19, when nobody had access to what kind of information that he should have. So if you recall, many people were wondering, what is this Arogya Setu app we're doing? It came out so handy to everybody. And this general awareness about the disease came in. So how do you build a data architecture so that it becomes easy to address the needs of the government? There, the demand and supply comes in. Now, today you have the suppliers to the various electronic modes. You have the government, you have the non-government actors, you have private sector, corporate private sector, you have so many others. And Google is at the center of the whole thing. Any information, the structured or unstructured you want, I have to access it, go to Google. So in the process, the man on the street doesn't know where is the chemist shop, where is the petrol pump, where is the traffic, where is the food that he wants to take, what is the value of the food, what is the nutrition value of the food. He doesn't have access to any of this. So what he requires is completely different than what is available in the market. Now, who fills in that gap? The state cannot provide all information. So this is where the citizen-generated data, CGD, which is now European, they are taking a lot of effort in this, is the major source of information. They are non-state actors. They can supply the data, but they have to be empowered. They have to be legally recognized. They have to have some standards. They have to have some credibility. And so that the person doesn't go back to Google and search, where am I? So today, the need of the request today is to have a set of suppliers who could be NGOs, who could be other organizations, who could be RWAs in urban cities, who could be panchayat, who could be some authority empowered by the state, who can supply the data, structure the data, make it more credible, and address it to the requirements of that area. So this is something which is lacking today. So we are missing the central objective of the whole architecture, ease of doing, ease of living. We have been able to address the ease of doing business thanks to the IT Act, thanks to the IT interface. We've been able to address a lot many issues are still there, but a lot has happened in that. But what is remaining is this consumer, the ordinary citizen who has not able to spell out his requirements on a day-to-day basis, it gets neglected. So your data governance architecture, privacy is another matter. I'll come back to a point in a moment. Needs to develop that kind of architecture to address that kind of requirement. Now, coming to the privacy issue, we have written two booklets on digital payments. When the demonetization started in the NITI Aayog and the Office of Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, we have written, and today it's a movement. Now, what happened was when the payment banks came up, and the Supreme Court struck down that you cannot share the data of the Aadhaar number details with the banks and others. You cannot link your bank accounts with the others and compulsorily because it's a privacy issue. I mean, I will not go into those issues again. But what has happened today is, notwithstanding all that, the digital payments have grown in volume and value. This is again driven by consumer who wants to access the merchant at the door, swipe a card and take the stuff out of the merchant. So here privacy becomes an issue. True, it is an issue, but not for the common consumer. He needs to be protected if there is a fraud, which is deliberate, which is coming from abroad, and he needs to protect his card debit card, it comes with credit card, by some unscrupulous elements. So that's the area where it needs to be protected. So privacy issue should not overrule the common overriding issue, that is the ease of living, which should be the central objective of Europe. And prepare an architecture both on the supply side and the demand side, so that I'll not say it's the market. The market has many distortions in that area, because the consumer himself cannot spell out what he needs on a day-to-day basis, and the supplier cannot address that. So some CGD is the right answer to that, but that has miles to go. And the National Statistical Office in every state needs to come back to this and say, well, I will be able to supply the data required to this at this credible rate, at this periodicity, at this confidentiality, at this level of granularity. So this is my take on the subject, and I think we should strive to make this as the main goal of the state architecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Satpathy, for your valued remarks. I would like now to move to Dr. Taylor. Dr. Taylor is a professor at Tilburg University and lead of Global Data Justice Project. Dr. Taylor, you have heard remarks by Dr. Patnaik and Mr. Satpathy with respect to use of data for fostering ease of living, and also letting the data markets evolve and develop, particularly in emerging economies like India. So do you see any conflict in terms of in maintaining or ensuring individual privacy at one hand, and also using the data for community or group benefit on the other hand? And also, is privacy actually an individual concept, or it needs to it needs to be looked through a broader lens of community privacy and group privacy? Over to you, Dr. Taylor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. First, thank you for having me here. It's wonderful to be able to learn from India's struggles to figure this question out. This is a good time for us all to listen to India, because with the passing of the GDPR, many things about the advantages and the gaps in data protection have become clearer to us. And thus I listened to Dr. Patnaik, for example, with great interest as he explains the different options that are visible to people post-GDPR to try and remedy some of the issues that have come up. So I think that Europe particularly can learn a lot from India's choices at this point and from watching what happens as a result of those choices. So my interests here are various. I watch in my work how data protection gets stretched to do things it's not necessarily designed to do. The primary thing that data protection does is to define a market, as the previous speakers have been saying. It's up to us what we mean by that. But the idea that it is a magic bullet for rights is a difficult one to demonstrate, I think. And so largely we need to think about rights, and that's why I'm interested in being on this call about the idea of the consumer. We need to think about important things like citizenship and intervention on the population through the lens of the data market when we think about data protection. So this becomes a very interesting problem. Here's the thing, even perfect data protection doesn't really do the job that we hope that it will do. We watch this happening around the world. However good our intentions, however copious the legislation, we still find we want to forbid certain things that we collectively find illegitimate and unwarranted, and that data protection doesn't always help us to do that. This is partly because the framing of data protection, at least in its origins in the North, tends to be around the idea that of the liberal Western individual who can claim their rights and who is in charge of their data and in charge of the world they live in. This is, of course, not how any of us function in regard to data, especially not people who are disadvantaged. But even for the elites, it's very hard to know where our data is going. It's very hard to talk about a framework that would give us traction over our data once it leaves our own devices. Because even those who are going to use the data don't necessarily know what will happen next. Once data becomes de-identified, in particular, it enters the realm of non-personal data, and there we really see issues with the public interest being preserved. So I'm interested really in that later stage that the law is not great on, how we can preserve the public interest and the interest of the people that the data relates to and represents, even when it starts traveling. If we take the example, for instance, of data from Arogya Setu in India, it's becoming apparent that the data is very powerful in ways beyond the original intent in collecting it. So this is, broadly speaking, public health, population level public health data that's being created by the Arogya Setu system. What it also does is it gives the potential to identify types rather than tokens, which are individual identifiable individuals, who are the focus of data protection law. Large data sets give us the ability to identify types and to act on those types. So once the data from Arogya Setu is de-identified, potentially it can pass to university researchers, but also to companies who might want to use it. Of course, they will believe their motives are upright and are in the public interest, but we lack a mechanism for actually determining whether they are right about that, even if they are acting in good faith. For instance, mobility data, which is what mobile phones tend to offer us, is some of the most revealing data in the world. It can show health status, but it can also show employment status, education level, social networks. It can show religion and ethnicity. It can show the job that people do. It can show where people are seeking healthcare. It can show what their families are doing. It can show all sorts of things that are very sensitive, even when de-identified, because then people, rather than individuals, become part of groups. And that may make the data more sensitive rather than less. For instance, in the US, if you want to make a Muslim registry, do it using phones, because certain phones stop moving 5 times a day and other phones don't. And there you have a Muslim registry completely de-identified. You can just look at the type of people whose phones stop moving 5 times a day. You can look at their consumer preferences. You can look at their movement patterns. You can use these things to select for that type of person and to do things to that group in society without ever identifying an individual. This becomes really problematic. To go back to the Arogya Setu data as an example, you could use movement and behavioral patterns, which are inferred from what is no longer personal data, to manipulate people to adopt particular apps. For instance, you could market predatory gambling or loan apps to particular groups of people in India based on their movement signatures without ever identifying individuals. You could target political advertising to people, as we know happens all over the world already, in really insidious and destructive ways. And you also don't have to be Indian to do this. We're also looking at a sovereignty situation where anyone could potentially buy the data in the end because it's not personal data. We don't treat NPD as if it were really sensitive. So I'm very interested in this problem. I think it's a broader problem than data protection, and it indicates that we need to think about data protection in context with other laws. Those laws include anti-discrimination laws. They include laws for connecting the public interest to the actions of government and of companies more broadly. And we do see the Indian Supreme Court taking significant interest in that, particularly around the debates around Aadhaar and the Supreme Court decision on privacy in Aadhaar, where it said that we essentially want a functional firewall between companies and civil registration data, so that they have to request and they have to have a good and legitimate reason for using civil registration data, that some data shouldn't just flow because it allows for intervention. There's not enough time to explain this further, but I would love to put in the chat, if I may, a link to a PDF of a book called Group Privacy. It's freely available using the first link in the blog post that will come up if you click on this link. The PDF is available and it's for free, and it lays out this problem, and it incorporates work from maybe 6 or 7 international thinkers, particularly around the developing world, on how this impacts different groups worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for your brilliant interventions and also sharing with us your work. While we are definitely referring to it in our submissions to different committees, but I think it will greatly benefit all the participants here. Now, I would like to move to Amlan Mohanty, who is lead government affairs, Google India. Amlan, you have sort of listened to 2 different or diverse perspectives. One which talks about sort of using data for public benefit and for ease of living. But you have also heard about how this sort of can be misused to pose some risks or challenges for consumer welfare or consumer benefits. Also, you are aware that private sector needs to play a very, very important role when it comes to data economy in India, and when we design the future of data in India. There have also been concerns regarding data collection and processing practices of private sector abroad and in India as well. So how do you see all this debate moving forward, and what is the role of private sector? Would we see more sort of self-regulation? How can we enable more competition so that there could be competition for privacy and data protection as well, so that we can have consumer welfare at the heart of data economy without necessarily compromising with innovation and other benefits with which data economy can result into. Over to you, Amlan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amol, and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and already I think it's been a fascinating conversation. So thank you to all of the speakers for sharing their insights. I think, to start with here, I mean, there are lots of questions in that question, but I think the way really is to have a dialogue. And I think, conversations like this is really progress. It's bringing together academics, policymakers, consumer organizations, and industry bodies to really talk about, I think, some of these fundamental questions that, even Dr. Taylor just mentioned. I think, there are a couple of threads, like you said, that Dr. Patnaik mentioned right in the beginning around data marketplaces. Dr. Satpathy mentioned, I think, this idea of ease of living as a primary objective. And also Dr. Taylor talking about public interest as an amorphous concept. And I wanted to just touch on all three to kind of answer your question. So I think I agree entirely with what Mr. Satpathy said. A user-centric, consumer-centric view is, I think, the solution to, I think, all of these problems. And I think that's something that across all stakeholder groups, whether it's government, industry, or consumer groups, can agree on. How do we place the user in front and center of this? And I think the way that I like to think about this, I think in the concept and the context of data sharing is, what are we really trying to achieve when we're trying to regulate, data through privacy frameworks or data sharing frameworks? And I think fundamentally the idea is how can we have users make informed decisions about how their data should be used, right? And I think the way that we should do that is to be able to align the interests of the user, the community at large, and also protecting the rights of industry, right? So to take the example of the public interest example that Dr. Taylor was talking about with respect to mobility data, and I just wanted to give the example of these community mobility reports that Google shared during the COVID crisis as perhaps an example of how we can use privacy enhancing technologies to produce aggregated data sets that could help inform policy. So essentially what you're doing is aggregating data of mobility patterns at a very large scale, completely de-anonymized, disaggregated, and independent of any demographic details, to be able to say, over a period of time, say 6 months, we've seen that mobility patterns during lockdown have reduced by 25%. And that we believe can help improve and inform public health policy decisions. Now, to take your question about what does this mean about potential misuse of this data, or and I think to Dr. Taylor's point, which is even if you're acting in good faith, what is the potential ancillary negative effects or inadvertent effects? I think those are very good questions to ask, and I think there's a role for self-regulation. And I think, companies over a period of time have evolved very robust policies for internal review, including, health ethics reviews, especially when you're dealing with sensitive data, involving health and mobility data. So I think there is a role for self-regulation. But I think this underlying concept of public good and public interest needs to be a collective decision. There is, as the Supreme Court has said, no definition of what public interest or public good is. It's a dynamic, subjective concept that evolves even with time. So how do we have more sustained discussions about whether community mobility data sets are a useful and beneficial purpose to put for a topic like this. I think the other way that I would answer this question is, what's the role for industry? I think the role of industry in all of this is to help build trust. And I think that speaks to some of the fundamental questions that were raised by Mr. Satpathy when it came to the user-centric perspective. What do users want? Users want transparency, users want accountability, users want predictability in terms of how their data will be used. And I think those are fundamental principles that will govern any data protection law. And as Dr. Patnaik eloquently was talking about in the context of the proposed law for India, these are principles that will be enshrined. And companies like Google, but I know small businesses in India, industry bodies welcome regulation that bring these principles into the fold in terms of how they regulate data. So just to take a few examples of what I think could help protect users' data, whether it's personal data or non-personal data, it's this idea of, I think, having very clear rules on purpose limitation and collection limitation. So an understanding of what that data will be put and used for. I think this idea of making things as far as possible opt-in and giving users choice, right? So consumer choice, I think, is front and center of all of these discussions. I think the idea that, and from an industry perspective, I think it's also important to understand that there needs to be some flexibility when you're talking about accountability. I think you posed the question to Dr. Patnaik, which is, how do you think about accountability? And I think that's a concept that across the industry, there is a lot of agreement that that is an approach. And why does that make a lot of sense? Is because in an accountability framework, you're, I think, able to accommodate a lot of flexibility because your outcomes are very clearly defined. You want to help ensure accountability if there is consumer harm. Now, what you're defining very clearly is consumer harm, but what you're not defining is how you have to ensure that accountability, right? So, companies can develop their own processes, their own systems to be able to ensure that there is no consumer harm caused. And I think that's a way, again, how we can align incentives between industry consumers. So I think that's really, I think we should fairly answer the way that I would answer your question. The last point I just wanted to talk about on, I think, data marketplaces. We're having, I think, a very interesting discussion in India on non-personal data and non-personal data sharing. I think the goal there really is how can we ensure that policies ensure that voluntary data sharing practices are incentivized. And some of the systems that Mr. Patnaik was talking about around data marketplaces are actually flourishing. And the way to ensure that they flourish is to have adequate incentives to identify the right market failures, right? So why is it that we're, ensuring that data sharing should be practiced and having the right incentives in place? And I think the way to do that, again, is to look at potential benefits for users and industry on both sides to ensure these incentives continue. And I think that's how we can have a flourishing data marketplace in India as well. I'll just stop there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Amlan, for your thoughts. Now, I would like to move to Neha. Neha works with Ikigai Law, which is a premier law firm in India working at intersection of all the issues that we have discussed right now. Neha, so you have heard what different speakers have to talk about evolution of data markets and how consumer data can be leveraged. However, I would like to sort of move a little bit different with the question that I would like to ask you is, in addition to the tension between sort of consumer rights or individual privacy rights and the community benefit that we are looking at through leveraging the data, we are also looking at a tension between individual rights, community rights, and the role of state in ensuring national security and mandating sharing of data across frameworks which are evolving. And not only mandating sharing of data, but also sort of identifying the originator or getting access to data for law enforcement purposes. So how do you see such tension between individual rights, community rights, and the role of state evolving, and how can we sort of come to a common a point from which we can move forward? And this is, as you know, this is happening across frameworks which are being discussed currently. So if you could throw some light on consistencies or inconsistencies across these frameworks as well. Thank you very much, and over to you, Neha.
Thanks a lot for having me here, Amon. Pleasure to be a part of this discussion, and congratulations to you and the team at CUTS for kicking off this series of discussions and dialogue as well. And I suppose that would be my answer to the second part of your question. I think it's a hard problem to solve, to be honest, right? Like it's a conversation that we've been having in India and many other countries around the world, right? And I'm pretty sure that it's a tension that we're all mindful of, and there are a whole range of different approaches that we could honestly try and keep trying, and then arrive at something that works. Then the point that Dr. Taylor was making earlier, right? Like you put in place a mechanism, you watch it play out over a period of time. You take its learnings, you take the learnings that you're getting from it, and then you sort of go ahead and keep evolving those frameworks through conversations and dialogues, not unlike the kind that we're having now. I think one of the fundamental things that we've although advocated is that, particularly not just in the field of data governance or internet governance, one of the underlying principles that we'd like to see for tech policy generally adopted is that all frameworks that we adopt be consultative, that actually keep in mind the interests of various stakeholders, and that are arrived after speaking to different stakeholders. The last thing that you want to see is heavy-handed regulation, where you identify a problem and then you identify a solution to go with that problem and say, hey, this is my problem statement. I think that this is the best way to solve this problem, and then and have that rolled out across the country, because I don't think that works. I don't think that that's in any stakeholder's interest, quite honestly. What you really want is, hey, this is a problem statement that we have. What are the different ways in which we could potentially solve this problem, such that it does two different things? One, it helps us realize whatever the objectives that we're trying to achieve are, which in this case could potentially be state access to information for a whole host of different reasons that the state might want access to that information, including, say, law enforcement purposes, national security, so on and so forth. But at the same time, being mindful of the fact that this is potentially the least harmful to the interests of other stakeholders and the least restrictive to all of the other rights and interests that different stakeholders might have. So I think that would be one of the overarching principles towards building the kind of frameworks, that you were talking about. And to the first part of your question, in terms of whether there is such a tension between individual rights as a whole and the role of the state, so on and so forth, I think So I think I would have a different view on this depending on the context in which we were having this discussion. I think in the way that I think in the NPD committee's characterization of data sharing and data access, for example, I have some very real concerns with that framework, because I don't think that it fully appreciates, some of the underlying rights that that companies might have in information. For example, intellectual property rights, right? So to that extent, I do think that there are tensions that exist with that framework. But in the context of, if you look at it in the context of other examples for law enforcement, for sharing access to with state for law enforcement purposes, I don't think anybody in the privacy community or the data governance community would argue that that is an unfair ask or an unfair aim. I think that there are some disagreements, though. Again, there is some tension with the aims, with the means with which the state is looking to get access to that information. And for me personally, that risk is further heightened simply because I don't think we have a robust enough surveillance law reform or a checks and balances on the powers of the state system in place in the country. So if you're looking at law enforcement access to information within this larger sort of constitutional scheme of things, where you do have an individual right to privacy, and you should have a robust enough system in place that does keep a check on the state's powers to be able to access information, then that's another area where which gives me a little bit of discomfort as well. and also I think in the encryption side, or some of the changes to the new intermediary guidelines that you were alluding to, right? Very often we tend to characterize the debate as this is a privacy versus a security debate, and I disagree with that characterization. I don't think it's a binary privacy or security. I don't think it's a binary privacy or security debate. I honestly think that security interests are also very well served if you have strong and robust privacy measures in place that including encryption. This is not to say that there aren't very valid concerns on the side of the state when it comes to thinking about issues of access to information. So I suppose then the way forward is, how do you preserve all of the good that comes that technologies like this bring in terms of privacy, in terms of the individual realizing a whole host of other rights through the use of these technologies, or as a result of privacy itself, while ensuring that other very legitimate aims and means are met. So yeah, I think I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Neha, for covering a wide ground within the limited time that you had, and for a fantastic explanation of different regimes. Now, I would like to come to Shrikant. Shrikant has been a tireless advocate for consumer rights. And Shrikant, you have heard what different speakers had to say. And basically, we have heard what the policy makers or the regulation community or regulators need to do or can do at an appropriate time to ensure consumer welfare and consumer interest. We've also seen what industry intends to do to promote innovation while maintaining consumer welfare. My question to you is simple: is what do you expect? How do you expect this to play out, and what do you expect consumers to do, and how that could be done, particularly in terms of empowering consumers, ensuring more transparency, accountability, and grievance redress for consumers, and how can we give the power back to consumers, if I may put it so bluntly. Over to you, Shrikant. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I have to leave,
Sure. Mr. Satpathy, before you leave, there is just one small question to you. Shrikant, can you hold on with your remarks for a couple of minutes? Thank you, Shrikant. So, Mr. Satpathy, there was one very interesting question that we received for you from audience. Mr. Shahim Kazir asks that how can citizens and activist groups push for a world where there is a balance between maintaining individual privacy, at the same time websites and apps are allowed to be operated independently and freely? I assume he is also referring to some of the orders by government recently around content takedown, etc. While also alluding to some of your remarks which you made previously. So, couple of minutes, sir, for your
I
response.
didn't get the question.
Sure. So the question was, how can citizens and activist groups push for a world where there is a balance between maintaining their individual privacy while at the same time allowing websites and apps to operate independently? Would you have some thoughts on this, sir?
Yeah, you see, the challenge is that, is so far it has not happened. You look at, non-state actors. In the government, we are today seized of the problem of how much research and development exports are taking place. I mean, if you look at, again, the different websites, you will not find that easy. So we have to depend on some non-state actors, the industry associations, and also go to some private sector. Google is one of them, and say, tell us how much R&D export you are doing and how much R&D expenditure you are doing. this is something public policy related matter, which is not consumer related matter, but we're struggling with it as of now. We are trying to give an award to the highest exporter, R&D exporter, and then the list of 100 was there. We started approaching all of them and found none of them responding. So there are issues, I agree, it's not an easy thing, but the state has to play a role in this, lay down the rules of the game for the non-state actors like the NGOs and others who are also to fill in that gap with the consent of the state. It will not happen overnight. It will not happen. Look at the way the RWA in the urban society operates. Now they are recognized societies, but they are not able to disseminate how many people are living in that area, what is their age profile, what is their sex profile, what was their occupation profile. They have never done that. So this is something can happen and can be done through the RWA. Similarly, in the village level also, it is possible for the self-help group to kind of chip in and prepare that kind of information, that kind of data. I'm not going into data as a big business. I know it's very big business. The market is thriving all over the world and it can be done anything. That's a separate world. It will take its own course. And like, today you had to, after 20 years, you're coming down with a set of rules to control the social media. Technology has taken over. And that technology also will take care of the data market. I'm sure about that. There will be rules and regulations. It's big business, I know that. But I'm looking at the consumer perspective. So there, these non-state actors have a tremendous role to play. It will evolve over a period of time. And technology will pave the way for that. I think I have answered that. Thank you very much for your.
Thank you so much, Mr. Satpathy. Thank you for your time and for joining in this discussion. Shrikant, sorry for the interruption, and can we move to your response? You are not audible, Shrikant.
Hear me now?
Yes.
So broadly, I had 2 points. So one is on the data economy as such. And what we are seeing in India is basically concentration of data, both personal and non-personal, that are being channelizing towards the state from both consumers as well as businesses. While at the same time, we're not kind of receiving back the proportional amount of data from the state, right? So this is like water and money. So for a healthy ecosystem, there has to be a continuous flow between all the stakeholders here. So, and it can't be, say, unidirectional flow of data, right? And for the growth of this entire data economy, there has to be continuous flow of data between all actors. What we are seeing with one state is essentially that consumers are getting much less data. And what we need more, what as consumers we need to actually become, is also become data consumers and kind of have access to more data, which I think is one of the kind of good intentions of the non-personal data framing, whereas the specifics of it obviously has larger concern for the industry in terms of putting the IP and etc. on that, which is causing some tension. So we've got to kind of have this sort of fine balance between the state, market, and the community, right? And what we're currently seeing though is the state and in sometimes even the industry viewing this data as a public good framing, which kind of limits viewing data solely through an economic lens, and that too probably a very narrow economic lens for a shorter term, is that it discounts all the negative externalities of data, right? Like including privacy, data security, economic value capture and appropriation, all of which are social harms that are function of data governance policies. And most often times, public goods and social harms can coexist perfectly well together. And this is where I would probably support Dr. Patnaik's view of adding a harm-based regulation. So where not we should probably have a multi approach in formulating our data policies, where it's not just the consent-based model or the rights-based model, or it's not just the harms-based model. We should probably have a harmonized model which kind of takes through, because more often you could, sticking to one model can doesn't necessarily kind of solve our problems. And this I'll also kind of take this same example in the context of data markets, right? So while data marketplaces are coming up and flourishing, and in which kind of gives more data sets to range of actors, including consumers, for making better advanced decision, right? So which kind of ultimately leads to products and services which benefits the consumers in the end, right? So, but this again, leaving this solely to data markets will kind of not fix certain problems, especially let's say when it comes to say grievance redress and so on, where sometimes there could be a common market failure, and that's where kind of the regulatory bodies have to come up. And one gap that I see today is that the data that's coming out of these two portions of that gap. Essentially, one is an entire sector kind of unregulated, which is the digital economy, the entire apps and services which fall under, say, no regulator directly. And then even when they are, say, in well-regulated sectors, like say finance, more often than not, we kind of have access issues to data, which is where again we need to kind of bring in some kind of a right to data model, where we have a transparency legislation for right to information, which is again narrowly focused on, let's say, public information from government departments and ministries. Right? We kind of need to have a slightly broader right to data, but that could again be ring-fenced on, let's say, consumer protection like ambit, so that there could be intellectual property and those data need not actually potentially come out, but then consumers would need to have, let's say, right to data when it comes to, let's say, consumer grievance redress and so on. So which is where we need to kind of make this fine balance on this NPD framing. One blanket framing on, let's say, like give us all the data is not going to help, and on the contrary, again, closing up and not giving any data is again not going to help consumers, because there has to be this flow of data that has to happen between all three stakeholders, between government, industry, and consumers. And this flow has to be continuous. And the moment this flow kind of stops, either a flow becomes unidirectional or kind of becomes a concentration of data with one of the parties, then the ecosystem kind of goes for a toss. So here I would say that this reduction of data asymmetry is a gap that we need to kind of fill in. And but again, we need to kind of say consider all stakeholders' viewpoints in this before kind of saying that this will be the data regulation for the.
Thank you so much, Shrikant, and completely agree on multi-stakeholderism approach, as was also alluded by different speakers to on as a way forward for data economy. So, we now have around 10 more minutes for audience questions and closing remarks by each of the panelists. So, and during this discussion, we have received a lot of questions from audience. So, this is how I would like to take this. I will pose some questions to the speakers one by one, and I would request each of the speakers to answer these questions and also state their sort of closing remarks within a couple of minutes. So I would like to start with Dr. Patnaik. Sir, obviously there are a lot of questions for you, but I would like to just pick and choose two. First is, as you might have noticed, government has stated privatization of public sector units as its key mandate going forward. So, this might result into a lot of data which is with the PSUs being accessed or going into the private hands. So what are your views in this, particularly in light of Article 12 of the Constitution of India, which might be interpreted as PSUs as functionality of the state? This is with from Mr. R. Nandi. Another question for you is that we are seeing multiple policies and multiple moving pieces as data economy and data governance is evolving in India. So how do we ensure more predictability, certainty, and uniformity to avoid any confusion and progress in an ordered mechanism? Thank you very much, and over to you, Dr. Patnaik.
The first question relating to the asset monetization and privatization that's taking place as a result of government policy. I would guess that this is my personal answer. I would probably think that once the privatization is taking place, then the owner of the data, whatever is with the public sector undertaking is a separate concept than the government. Government is one, but the public sector undertaking in question is another body corporate in a legal language. And therefore, whatever data it is owner of in terms of balance sheets and so whatever, I think that, I guess, has to go with it. But if it is in conversation or in interaction with the government or the ministry relating to certain data, which is crucial, significant, then how it will be dealt with, I guess that would have to form a part of the privatization terms and conditions. But very good point. And let me also tell him that whoever raised that question is that I will flag it to the Secretary of the Department of Investment and DIPAM privatization investment, who is looking into this aspect, because there could be data sets which are being shared by a particular public sector entity with the government, whose flow might get affected once it changes hands. And in order to make that data flow uninterrupted, maybe there should be separate provisions in the terms of sale. The second question, I really didn't get it. Can you just come to that question again, please, very fast?
Sure. So as you know, there are a lot of moving pieces in data economy. There are governance frameworks which are being discussed, which might lead to a lot of confusion, given these have been discussed at a sector level, at state level, and also at federal level of different kinds. So how do we create much more certainty and predictability around governance frameworks so that we can have orderly growth of data economy and avoid knee-jerk reactions?
That's true, very true. In fact, this is what I have written in several articles, that many of our responses are knee-jerk, responding to something that is happening across the border in some of our borders, by countries across some of our borders. But once we have a full-fledged regulation law in place and regulations backing it up, and codes of practices and standards of anonymization, many things which go with a robust data protection or non-personal data protection framework, non-data framework. I think we would have lessened the chances of such confusion. So the first thing is we need to have that law, and then we have to have the regulation, and then we will need to have maybe the rules and the codes of practice and various standards and procedures, and most importantly, a kind of robust third-party audit accounts and inspection mechanism, and putting it back into the governance model, improving it in a delta fashion from time to time would be most important. So I would say that this confusion would initially remain and continue to remain till we have the we have the laws. Having said so, I can also say that no amount of hard coding of laws will take care of all contingencies or all kinds of situations. So sometimes the rules should be very clear. The rule-based lawmaking has to also come in place, or rule-based regulations has to come in place, because once the principles are set, for example, in the personal data protection, the principle has been set by the Honorable Supreme Court that privacy is a fundamental right. It's a part of right to life. And similarly, under 19.2 of the fundamental rights, it says that there are reasonable restrictions when you are accessing any kind of right or freedom. So therefore, there will be some state rights. So once the principles are laid out and accepted, I think confusions will start diminishing. And then once the principles are set, it has to be hard-coded into law, as we are doing now. But greater work remains. That is, once the Data Protection Authority comes up for personal data and for the non-personal data, they have espoused the cause for another non-personal data authority, which I don't really agree. But eventually, if they do, then these authorities will start making regulations. And once they start making regulations, then the acts will actually kick in. But there would be issues which I raised in another article in Times of India, that India is a very, very vast country. There is a huge federal structure. And as I said, the personal data protection or the entire data thing that we are talking about is not necessarily what the law is covering. The law is covering manual data as well, data maintained manually, data maintained in ledgers in the panchayat and tahsildar offices, which can actually get leaked and cause harm to the data principle. So those also have to be taken into board. So how do you merge and integrate that into this entire space is also going to be a huge challenge, which I foresee.
Thank you, Dr. Patnaik. Moving quickly.
So I'll take leave. Thank you so much, I think.
Thank you for your time, sir. And we will definitely prepare a policy brief out of this discussion and also pursue with your office
Right.
as usual.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists and all the viewers.
Thank you, sir. I'll now quickly move to Dr. Taylor. Dr. Taylor, we have a lot of questions for you, but I will choose just two and request you to answer them very quickly. There is a tendency to use or to consider usage of data for public good. Do you have problems with this connotation of public good and its usage and interpretation? Do you think this could result into unintended exclusion or inclusion errors? And is this a facet of technological solutionism, or a technology first or a technology only approach to solve real problems which cannot only be solved through technology? Over to you, Dr. Taylor. Thank you.
Once again, a very easy question. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, the public good, right? This is a hugely difficult question. So I'm going to answer this in a broader way by saying that we tend to make data protection law all around the world with the economy in mind, rather than the worst case scenario for the public in mind. I think it's really important to have both things in mind. We shouldn't shut out the idea of data as an economic good, but also if it is really to be a public good, then we have to consider how we dynamically link the use of data to the public interest, no matter where it goes, no matter who is using it. And that is a governmental and a governance challenge that no country or region has succeeded in so far. I think, like democracy, we may wind up with the best of a set of inadequate responses. We just have to find the best possible inadequate response that we can and be willing to change it if necessary. So we should go into this with the assumption, I think, that anything that can be monetized and used to influence and manipulate will be. And that in most cases, consent for that will be given by intermediaries, such as local government, firms, app developers, rather than the people implicated in the data. Really, in most cases, it doesn't come down to the individual to be informed and to consent. So the central question is, like I said, how to give people traction on this. And Neha spoke about this as well, that there's this fuzzy boundary between personal data and non-personal data. And that can only really be managed by conceptualizing data as inherently tied to the public interest. Because then it doesn't matter, so we don't have to have these very fine legal arguments for whether something is personal or not. It's all personal when we think that it's all stuff that can affect us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. I'll quickly move to Neha. Neha, we have a question from Rahul Shaw, wherein he asks wherein he asks about the intersection between the data protection and the Competition Act. He says that will data collection ever come under the purview of Competition Act, given the rise and relevance of data markets? Your thoughts on this, please.
Thanks a lot, Amol. And yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's also one that I think both data protection and competition authorities around the world are grappling with. And honestly, look, I mean, in the current Indian scheme, I honestly think that the way the current Competition Act is structured, it's wide enough to look at um, different types of consumer harms as well as address market failures, whether it's in the form of abusive dominance or whether it's in the form of other kinds of anti-competitive agreements. And from what we understand through conversations with a lot of competition lawyers, the Competition Commission does tend to look at this, does tend to look at facts fairly holistically. And then if in the view of the commission, they do feel that there are data governance or data sharing practices or data collection, whatever data use practices that do have a competition angle to it, then they will very much inquire into those as well. But you see these as you see these as part of larger practices that a business engages in any case. And I think that the way that the current law is framed and worded, it is wide enough to allow that to allow that discretion.
Sure. Thank you so much, Neha. The next question is for Amlan. Amlan, there is a question around the lines of fostering competition for privacy. Do you think in coming times, privacy and data protection can be seen as prime tokens for competition within the industry? Can this act as an impetus for industry to enhance practices that can incorporate responsible data use? What are your thoughts on this?
That's a great point. And I think, again, going back to the point about this being user-centric, I think absolutely if privacy becomes a competitive advantage and a tool that businesses use to compete against each other, that eventually only benefits the user. So I think that's definitely something, an outcome that's positive. We already see indications of that. There are, I think, companies right now arguing about monetization models and whether there's a benefit in some sense in one business model that protects privacy over another. And I think users are really, I think, leading into this discussion, also trying to make their voices heard and trying to bring strong arguments for why one business model supersedes another. And you can see that industry is reacting to this as well and making changes in how they collect data. And just to give you an example from my world, so Google, for example, just yesterday announced broad changes to data collection practices on Google Pay, right? And talking about things like opt-in measures, transparency around how data will be used, ensuring that users, if they want, will have access to personalized services, but they can always opt out, and will always, I think, continue to have access to services even if they opt out. So I think there is a very competitive market right now, and it's not just, I think, consumer-based services. I think enterprise services also focus on privacy and security primarily, and there are obviously very specialized security apps, that are encryption-based, VPN services. So I think as in India, especially as awareness grows around privacy, we will see that privacy and privacy-enhancing tools as being extremely as a competitive advantage.
Sure. Thank you so much, Amlan. And the last question is to Shrikant. Shrikant, you are seeing that consumers across data governance frameworks are required to interact with intermediaries. It could be trustees or aggregators or brokers. So how do you see this sort of conversation between consumers and data intermediaries, if that can be put it like that, and how can we ensure that consumers' interests are protected? A minute or so for your thoughts.
Yeah. So one thing currently is consumers are kind of largely blind to these intermediaries. So we don't even know who the data brokers are. I mean, the first step would probably be with any kind of data governance framework is to basically identify them and say these are the data brokers who handle your data. I think we are at a stage where across, I think GDPR did bring in some visibility around that, but I think a lot more is needed on identifying data brokers, and then that could then lead consumers to kind of interact with those intermediaries and then form data policies, and probably not necessarily with the intervention of government, but through direct bilateral uh, interactions.
Sure. Thank you so much, Shrikant, for your remarks. Now, I would request my colleague Setu, who has been working with our team for quite some time now on the data economy, to propose the vote of thanks and to, if possible, summarize this discussion and give the closing remarks on behalf of CUTS. Setu, over to you.
Hi, Amol. Thank you so much for moderating this discussion. Thank you so much for all our panelists and everyone who is attending. I will try to summarize this incredible session. We started with discussing how consumer perspective is key in forming the future of data governance in India. We established that it is a crucial time for having this discussion because so many of our regulations are under deliberation right now. We heard from Dr. Patnaik that the PDP will ensure the balance between privacy and security, which is relieving to hear. And Dr. Patnaik also talked about accountability model and how it can benefit the consumers. We heard from Mr. Satpathy about citizen-generated data model and how it can be useful in service delivery, particularly. We heard from Dr. Taylor talking about how data protection laws are often stretched and repurposed to do things that they were not really designed to do, and how there are different challenges which are often not realized when coming up with such regulations. Amlan mentioned how consumer-centric view of data governance, along with sustained dialogue between stakeholders, can help us address these issues. Neha mentioned that it's important that we take learnings from different kinds of regulations and framework, and the need for robust checks and balances for state powers. From the consumer perspective, we heard Shrikant talk about how data asymmetries need to be addressed, as well as market imbalances. I think that's how I would like to summarize this discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor, Amlan, Neha, Shrikant, and all our participants for joining. And we hope to keep engaged, have a sustained discussion with you, keep the dialogue ongoing to have a sustainable digital future of India. Thank you.
Thank you, Setu. And on behalf of CUTS, I would like to thank everybody. And I would like to just reemphasize that this is not the closing of this discussion. This is just a beginning. This is just the first of our interactions that we'll do periodically. And we'll reach out to each of the stakeholders, in particular the speakers, to hear their thoughts on the policy brief that we are preparing, and also will engage with policy influencers and other relevant stakeholders to ensure a robust data economy for India going forward. Thank you very much once again, and the session is now officially over. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.